But the topic of this meeting is the BRICS nations, which for us is not an intellectual exercise. I mean, those of us that have been fighting and in solidarity with Ukraine for the last year have been painfully aware of leaders like Lula who are in solidarity with Putin. I mean, it's not an intellectual topic. It's really a life and death topic. And for us, I mean, the last bullet point in the meeting announcement was, you know, how can we link up with people like Patrick and Flavio and Kavita and all the BRICS nations that are truly believe in the principle of international working class solidarity. So Kavita Krishna sent a note that she was called away to an emergency meeting, and she's going to try to show up late, but we just don't really know. All right, so Patrick, I don't know a whole lot about you except that what was in the meeting announcement. So I'm just going to introduce you as a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. He teaches and writes about political economy, political ecology, and social mobilization. He has also taught in Britain, South Korea, and the United States. A theme over the years has been his views on South Africa's move from racial to class apartheid in the form of neoliberalism. He has also written extensively about BRICS.
Thank you so much. Great. It's wonderful, and especially if, as I was vaguely tempted, I can go on a bit beyond 20 minutes, assuming that either one or two, or or both of our our other speakers don't arrive. So if that's not the case, then Cheryl, you'll give me a 5-minute warning in case I do actually have to cut at 20. Indeed, I'm sitting here in Johannesburg. I'm in the sort of bohemian suburb near the universities called Melville. But just behind me is the new central business district. The capitalists abandoned the one downtown where they really accumulated massively through half the world's gold at one point being underneath our feet here. And then they moved to a place, Sandton, which way off in the distance you can see from here. And that's where in August 22 to 24, there will be the BRICS summit. And the main thing is the question of whether we'll get our resistance together. We've been exceptionally divided in the independent left, and I assume I'm sort of speaking to the family, which is international independent left, distinct from those who have, from the standpoint of a left rhetoric, an anti-imperialist rhetoric, decided that the internecine battles between states is more important than the broader processes of class struggle and capital accumulation. And that group, sometimes we call them here at the campus, will be exploring a little bit more on Tuesday at the link that was provided to the global Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. So let's quickly go to what I'm expecting and what the issue areas associated with BRICS, particularly because of geopolitics connecting to Ukraine and to arms deals and to arms, to military exercises and to abstentions in the United Nations. All of these matters are terribly important. Let me see if I can succeed in bringing up some slides. And these slides do go on. I mean, I didn't really cut, so I am really going to count on Cheryl to tell me if I'm babbling too much. 5 mandates: the geopolitics, the only really potentially progressive thing that might come from the BRICS 2023 summit here would be advancing de-dollarization, but it's a very thorny area, given that the forces that are aiming to do so have some major problems. And then we have the sub-imperial multilateral arrangements, and I'll focus a little bit on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and internal super-exploitative relations and the sort of regional role as well. We will see from this BRICS summit, as we did in 2013 in Durban and 2018 also here in Johannesburg, some form of resistance. We're not really sure what form it'll take. Sometimes it's just academics sitting around and NGO folk, but sometimes we do get mass movements that have the time and space to think globally and in BRICS terms, a people's BRICS. Normally what their self-mandate is to raise an alarm to the world, but especially to our international progressive solidarity community about the fake alternatives to Western corporate imperial power, and instead to promote international solidarity from below. Here are some of the issue areas. There's the geopolitics, the patriarchy, climate crisis, economic injustices, human rights violations, sovereignty, with the case of Russia invading Ukraine, multilateral sub-imperialism, US dollar hegemony. And so probably, I can't say for sure, but at least a few days beforehand, and at a protest on the 22nd, there will be a BRICS from below presence, as it was in 2018. Those of you who'd like more, just send me an email, and these are some of the books that have come out over the past decade or so that illustrate where this left critique is. And I'll personally say that, to me, identifying BRICS within broadly a world system, I'm not necessarily in the sociology school, the world systems camp, but I appreciate the attempt to find a core, a semi-periphery, and a periphery. And it's when the G7 felt and it was then the G8 in 2008 especially. I mean, this G20 goes back much further to 1998, but it was when the international financial crisis occurred and George W. Bush felt that they needed to bring in this new layer of G20 to especially boost the financial resources to deal with the crisis. And there, the imperial and sub-imperial relationship, including the rogue sub-imperialists, which I can explain where we're trying to take some of our theoretical arguments, that these are normally loyal, especially when it comes to the core features of imperialism, corporate power and the neoliberal agenda. But the, let's say, rogue imperialism, where, as you know, you sort of still get complaints from the Russians that a vast amount of their funds were expropriated last March, and a rogue imperialism, a rogue, you know, not respecting international property rights. So we're in a fluid situation. What it will make it even more fluid is the likely outcome of the Santon, the Johannesburg meeting, which is a BRICS Plus, and these are the countries that are anticipated during, actually it's changing bit by bit, a brand new list, but most of these are in it, including the likes of Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Egypt, Afghanistan, Thailand, Indonesia, lots of interesting countries from the Middle East and Asia, from Africa, in addition to Egypt, Algeria, Senegal, Nigeria, and from Latin America, Argentina, Nicaragua, Mexico, Venezuela have been also mentioned. Where will we find, theoretically, a way to describe this? I think in the new translation of Mauro Marini's Dialectics of Dependency, which Monthly Review Press has put out late last year. And the idea of collaborating actively that Marini described his native Brazilian leaders after the 1964 coup, with imperialist expansion, assuming in this expansion the position of a key nation, and notwithstanding antagonistic cooperation. In other words, that the class structure of, especially at that time, a more patriotic bourgeoisie would naturally conflict with the imperialist bourgeoisie. An update from 2004, the new imperialism, David Harvey. The general problem of overaccumulation of capital, of the capitalist crisis of the 70s through the present, was in dealing with the medium-term and long-term capacity of the capitalist system to overaccumulate and managing that properly. So what we found was first this sort of middle layer, the BRICS, were absorbers, but then became also producers of surplus capitals as much of the manufacturing base moved to this former periphery, now a semi-periphery, especially the east coast of China. And they then became competitors on the world stage. And then sub-imperialisms arose. Now, what Harvey's doing is pulling, especially in that book, The New Imperialism, Rosa Luxemburg's framing, which is rather than inter-imperial rivalries that motivated Lenin and Bukharin and Hilferding and the others of the early 20th century. What Luxembourg did was more the non-capitalist relations. And there, this systemic spatio-temporal fixes the geographical movement, the temporal movement, but also a more extreme form of accumulation by dispossession. That is, when capital goes into these crises, it ignores the sort of mandates of fair exchange and becomes much more capable of actual looting. Now, let me switch to some geopolitics, having made my confessions on the theory side. Vladimir Putin is under the International Criminal Court warrant of arrest for crimes against Ukrainian children moved during this invasion. And then there's been this question. Now, the summit was originally announced in Durban, the third largest city, and it was actually announced the time and the place by Sergei Lavrov, and he was in Eritrea when he did so. But now they've just moved it to Johannesburg. And the question is whether Putin will attend, given this warrant of arrest. There is now a brand new, sort of 10 days old, major additional problem, which is that South Africa has been identified as an arms dealer. Now, the general line of argument, I'm not sure if there's feedback. Am I able to request that people mute if they're not right?
Yeah, I'm looking.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm going to see.
Right. Unless it's my feedback. Okay. Now, this is the sort of third worldist line, which is absolutely appropriate, right? That how's the US upset about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and not about Israel in Palestine, for sure. But then this sort of false equivalence or, whataboutism emerges. And this is the critique, which is now normally coming from our liberal petty bourgeoisie. And it particularly 10 days ago became a matter of national concern and led to a 4% crash in the currency in a few hours because of this red ship, the Lady R. And where you see it is in the Cape Town metropolitan area, but in a little port, the naval base of South Africa, it's a place called Simonstown. And late at night, having turned off its transponder, this ship allegedly both unloaded but then uploaded what the US ambassador 10 days ago said was weaponry, ammunition. We're not really sure because South Africa doesn't have a particularly effective export base for the kinds of weapons that Russia would use. In fact, what South Africa normally exports is to NATO countries. And so they're NATO compatible, but not Russia compatible. We still don't know what was on that red ship, but that's caused all manner of consternation. Mischief making, as the finance minister said, we don't really know who did what. It could have been a mischief maker who was uploading something. So we're kind of checking all the arms dealers. What would they have been doing? And you'll find on ZNet today my article about that. Now, there is a denial. This is the defense minister. We did not send fuck all, like fucking anything, fuck all to Russia, not even a piece of Chappie's chewing gum. So kind of very upset, and there's a very strong anti-imperialist layer in the African National Congress as they get more and more desperate. As for President Ramaphosa, there you see the US ambassador and the Ukrainian ambassador trying to figure out, well, what was there? And President Ramaphosa's, kind of consistently muffled in more or less everything he does. He's just unable to move an agenda forward. He comes from corporate neoliberal power and took office in 2018. The last 5 years have been, quite a mess. And particularly because the UAE has just refused to extradite some of the main criminals who corrupted the South African state, the famous Gupta family. And then the UAE leadership have just landed for a month holiday last month in one of the sort of resort areas. It's really looking quite, let's say, farcical, what South Africa's geopolitics. Let's look at economics, because in the last couple of years, the G7's relative decline in purchasing power parity, gross domestic product output, compared to BRICS is certainly noticeable. However, that can disguise what I think is also happening, which is that the BRICS are not just growing in relative GDP, especially led by India now, the fastest growing, and China, but also they're part of a deglobalization process. Those two things are not contradictory. When Jim O'Neill came forward with the idea of a BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, a BRIC as the building bricks of the 21st century, and South Africa joined in 2010, it did look in 2001 like this would be a good bet for the core drivers of trade and globalization. It turned out not to be, because as the world economy stagnated after the great financial crash of 2008, it was actually the BRICS, and particularly China, that led the deglobalization. Their accumulation process was much more internal. And now that makes it very interesting, because there's a little bit more scope, even though China has actually been buying more US dollar-denominated securities, although less US Treasury bills, according to a Reuters report a few weeks ago. There is the sense that this strong BRICS, with more potential for handling a deglobalization process and the fraying of the global value chains being part of that, would allow a de-dollarization. And the different ways I'm going to try to expand upon next month when we hold a conference. I'll send you the information at University of Johannesburg, trying to deal with how particularly a new central bank cyber currency, maybe some gold backing, certainly inter-BRICS currency deals, sort of what we used to call kind of South-South barter trade, and other ways perhaps to identify routes to delegitimize and maybe over time reduce dependency on the dollar. And with Jerome Powell having such high interest rates, and then before that having such generous quantitative easing and throwing money at the rich, it definitely is time to get off the dollar. I don't know if anyone in the House will disagree, but the big question is this the group to do it? So let's look at the key example of whether de-dollarization has made any, let's say, headway through the BRICS. And interestingly, the BRICS New Development Bank is the only one of the major institutions, of the institutions at all, that has stood the test of time since it was announced in 2014 in a Brazilian summit. And the BRICS New Development Bank sort of has $100 billion nominal capitalization, but is only lent in the order of 23 or something billion. So it's much, much smaller than the major multilateral banks, especially the World Bank. It's meant to be a sort of more green version. And two of the people who helped to at least put their imprimatur in it included Joseph Stiglitz and Nick Stern, both former World Bank chief economists. But what I found curious is that the BRICS Bank has been run by very orthodox bankers until this year, when President Lula has just installed former President Dilma Rousseff as the new president. What she'll do and whether she'll drop her own orthodoxy, which in 2013 led to the tensions in Brazil, I'm sure Fabio will tell us more. That remains to be seen, but I know everybody around and looked at the loans that they made, and they're very orthodox loans. And this is the real test, isn't it? What would happen when SWIFT blocked Russian deals and then made it impossible for Russia to pay its debt, even though Putin wanted to? He wanted to repay foreign debt, and then he was basically forced into a bankruptcy by July last year. Sensing that, the BRICS New Development Bank in March joined the world financial boycott of the BRICS, even though Moscow is a 20% co-owner. The same was done by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So we've seen defaults from Russia, 1998 under Yeltsin, 1917, that was a very honorable default. And we've seen some emerging economies, large ones, Argentina, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, add Bangladesh. In the last few months, we've seen Ghana, and before that, Zambia default. So this is a very interesting problem because of general concern about these emerging markets and their exposure to Euro markets. And so the New York credit rating agencies did downgrade the BRICS New Development Bank. You can see two of the three BRICS have done relatively well in terms of their strengthening of their currency, India and China. But when Brazil, Russia, and South Africa borrow from the BRICS Bank, it's normally in dollars. Dilma said, no, we're going to try to get to 30% in local currencies. But even then, there'll be very high interest rates. The interest rates are already among the highest in the world. Now, without going into all of the big theoretical processes about why there's all this finance out there, and sorry, I should have omitted all these slides, and what financialization looks like and where the BRICS fit. Let me switch to what it looks like here. We are in such an interesting crisis that I think conforms to this overall theory from Das Kapital, that capital overaccumulates, you get a decline in the rate of profit, and then we get a boost with rising profits from the extractive industries. And that's also picked up again this year, since 2020, about 2.5 years of high commodity prices, platinum, gold, coal, especially iron ore. But we've not seen gross fixed capital investment. We've not seen anything like the apartheid era of a patriotic bourgeoisie reinvesting. So that's part of the story, is that white capital, the dominant capital by far, is unpatriotic, is not interested in reinvestment. It's really interested in taking money out of the country. And as a result, massive illicit financial flows, up to 7% of GDP, according to the Treasury, led to the gray listing, that is financial sanctions against South Africa by the Financial Action Task Force. So lots of our discussions about what happens internally, at least in my case, would relate to these processes of overaccumulation and globalization, but deglobalization as well. But let me switch from there, because I think we're all sort of familiar with the big macro context, to some of the other aspects of what we're all interested in today. What will happen with the BRICS? There are some people, and I'm going to use my dear friends, I'm hoping we keep good talking and working relations, Radhika Desai, who've been really excited by the BRICS. And this is, I think, the case at the current time, but certainly in 2014, 2013, when the BRICS 2013 met in Durban, and lots of discussion about alternatives to the BRICS. Horace Campbell, one of our great Pan-Africanist analysts, hoping the BRICS contingent reserve arrangement would replace the International Monetary Fund. Walden Bello with a similar idea that both the BRICS Bank and this contingent reserve arrangement aim to break the global North's chokehold on finance and development. And President Jacob Zuma gave them all of this kind of hot rhetoric before he was kicked out in early 2018. The ANC is part of the global anti-imperialist movement, historically connected to the countries of the South, and BRICS is primary for our movement. I was poisoned. I almost died just because South Africa joined BRICS under my leadership, which he repeated a few times, and indeed he had been poisoned and went to Moscow to get the antidote in 2014. I prefer to turn to the late Samir Amin, a bit more sober of a perspective, saying, well, actually the problem about imperialism's economic leg, globalized neoliberalism, in contrast to its political leg, is that some countries in the BRICS at best walk on only one leg. They reject the geopolitics of imperialism, but accept economic neoliberalism. Vijay Prashad acknowledging that the BRICS efforts like the alternative credit rating agencies didn't take off. And now several right-wing countries have emerged within the BRICS bloc. You would name them as especially India, Brazil, and even South Africa from an economic standpoint. And then we have, as I said, a problem of excessive liberalization and the attempt to reform the IMF. Just one more minute, is that right, Linda? Okay, well, let me race ahead and just say that—
Do you need more time?
A little bit, if nobody else is in the house from India and Brazil, allow me just a little bit more. I wanted to make a couple more points about this, the sort of talk left, walk right when it comes to international finance. There's always an effort to complain about the IMF and the World Bank, their undemocratic form. There is, starting next week, an Indian taking over at the World Bank. His name is Ajay Gupta, but he's not genuinely an Indian anymore. He's been totally assimilated. He was the head of MasterCard, and you can find in Counterpunch and CADTM and ZNet our recent critique of the kinds of predatory activities that Ajay Banga is known for. So we're not finding any change at the leadership. But even when there was a move to increase the BRICS voting power, which occurred in 2015 at the IMF, China increased by 37%, Brazil 23%, India 11%, Russia 8%. That was not at the expense of the North. It was at the expense of Nigeria, lost 41%, as did Venezuela, Libya 39%, Sri Lanka, Uruguay. The reason is they didn't have enough money to put in. Even South Africa lost 21%. So 4 of the BRIC countries, minus South Africa, increased their voting power, but they didn't do anything to change the way the IMF works. I could go into more details about this BRICS New Development Bank. What we'd really wanted to see as alternatives to the BRICS in financing, what we instead got over this period. The details are heartbreaking. For example, we hoped that in 2015, in July, that instead of the wonderful no vote against the IMF austerity and the EU austerity, that there would be an opening for refinancing Yanis Varoufakis's finance ministry by going to the then host of the BRICS, Russia. And there was a little move in that direction, but nothing happened. And so anyway, lots of tragedies along the way, including around the efforts of particularly Hugo Chavez to get a new Bank of the South up and running. So let me just sum up from Vishwas Satgar, one of my colleagues here in Johannesburg. The BRICS rhetorically assert an alternative to key features of Western imperialism, while in reality they fit tightly within it. And this fits through amplified neoliberal multilateralism, serving both the BRICS and the West, the regional displacement of accumulated capital, financialization, and persistent super exploitative social relations. So the BRICS all generally promote extreme spatio-temporal fixes and the predatory condition known as accumulation by dispossession. To me, this is really what being a sub-imperial bloc is all about. I have been trying to update that with some discussions about the BRICS in the context of Ukraine, but I'd like to just end, if there's one more minute, Cheryl.
Okay,
I just reminding you that the most critical issue for our future generations is the climate crisis. And here's where sub-imperialism and the US role in managing the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You see Barack Obama marching in 2009. He just won the Nobel Prize a couple of days before, and also he went to Copenhagen for that big summit. And he, with the help of the National Security Agency, Edward Snowden reliably informs us, found out where these 4 other leaders, Jacob Zuma in the bottom left, Lula, Wen Jiabao, and Manmohan Singh. They were sitting in a little green room strategizing, and he marched in. He talks about it in his autobiography. And what they came up there, because you can see them, United States, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, that's called a basic group. There's no Russia at the table. And the United States. These are the main polluters. So what is the interest of imperial global climate policy and sub-imperialism? Well, it's just to keep emitting. And there's one little African country in this G20 that's part and parcel of this project. And I think that's one of the aspects. It may not relate immediately to the Ukraine war, but for any socialist who's interested in the problem with capitalism, it is that imperialism and the United States and Europe at the core have ways of especially buying off the African delegations, those most adversely affected. South Africa is critical as a sub-imperial bloc, as Lumumba Diaping, a great leader of Africa, put it. He singled out South Africa, that some members of that delegation sought to disrupt the unity of the bloc. And we saw that 2 years later in Durban with our protesters there in the bottom right, getting the cold shoulder from the elites, and then the COP21, the Paris Climate Agreement. So we are trying, as a very last slide or two, to show these contradictions. Here's some scenes from 2013 and March of about 500 on first the US Embassy, we must be clear. So you kind of fight imperialism, to be sure, and also sub-imperialism, and lots of ways in which that pushed forward the message to not carve up Africa, and a similar set of slides I didn't get around to putting on for Johannesburg in 2018. We hope we'll be able to muster that in the city, just down the road there, in Sandton, the Central Business District, August 22nd. So be with us in spirit, and we hope to keep as much solidarity going. Oh, I see Fabio is in the house, so I'll be able to turn over to him. Fantastic, thanks.
Okay, great. Well, Fabio has joined us. Welcome, Fabio. We're really glad that you're able to be here. We still do not have Kavita, so we don't know if we're going to have the third speaker or not, but we're going to go ahead and turn to Fabio, and I'm just going to introduce him very, very briefly. He is in Brazil, and he is a transit worker and a member of the Independent Brazilian Union Federation, Contulas. He's also a member of the Unified Socialist Workers' Party of Brazil, and he has a long history of worker organizing and writing about the workers' struggles in Brazil. So Fabio, our original plan was to have each speaker take 20 minutes, but we gave Patrick extra time because, well, we had a lot of important things to say.
I was going to suggest 25 minutes.
Yeah. So we'll unless if Kavita joins us, however, which we hope we will, we will, still plan to have her speak. So yeah, go ahead, Fabio.
Okay, Chair, thank you for having me. Patrick, congratulations for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. Look, I will limit to talk about Brazil, okay, and the BRICS. First of all, I think it's important for us to see that Brazil changed its position in the International Division of Labor. before the Washington Consensus, I mean, 30 years ago, what happened? Brazil was a very industrialized country. The industrial sector was stronger than the agribusiness. And we also had a strong participation of state-owned companies in the Brazilian economy. The Brazilian economy was something like this: 1/3 it was state-owned companies, 1/3 of the economy was controlled by the Brazilian bourgeoisie-owned companies, and 1/3 by transnationals. But what happened after 30 years of neoliberal policies, it changed a lot the situation of Brazil in this international division of labor. So we suffered a process of denationalization, so a wave of privatizations, and also at the same time, a deindustrialization process, which is relative, but it's visible. It's the industrial sector concentrates today with the agribusiness. So food processing industries are developing, but others are vanishing. What else? And today, the main sector of the Brazilian economy is agribusiness, the most powerful one. The analysts, the bourgeois analysts, they say that in this international division of labor for Brazil, there is a space that Brazil could develop related to green capitalism, either related to the rainforests exploration or electric cars, and certainly it will increase the mining industry in Brazil, as in Chile, Bolivia, because of these new technologies demands. So the situation of Brazil today is much worse than it used to be. You see, it is still a capitalist country, but the situation today is much worse. And things got even worse after the world economic crisis, this one of 2007, 2008. It did not affect Brazil so strongly. The main effects appeared years later, particularly in 2015, 2016, when there was a recession in Brazil together with a high inflation, a situation that the better paid workers, the middle classes were flattened, you see, and unemployment was on the rise. And it's something that we did not see any solution since then. So that's the situation we have Brazil. Now, I would like to tell you about the politics of the Brazilian capitalists, the bourgeois class, how they see the situation. One sector, which is the largest one, still stands for liberal democracy, new liberal policies, for sure, and together with these World Bank policies of social compensation, you see, for the sectors that are excluded from the economy to have some kind of benefits, food stamps or something like this, in order to keep a stability for the capitalists to exploit the working class. But there is another sector, which is a minority, but they are increasingly important, which stands for a Bonapartist regime, you see, a Bonapartist regime, and to explore everything they can, even if you need to put down the Amazon rainforest, they put down to stop the native Brazilian reserves or the quilombos, which are the former blacks enslaved people reserves. And also a kind of ultra neoliberal policies. You see, this minority is the one that was represented by our former president, Jair Bolsonaro. So Jair Bolsonaro, he had a section of the bourgeoisie with him on top of the petty bourgeois and better off for sections of the working class. But as you can see, both sectors of the bourgeoisie, they don't stand for a kind of sovereign Brazil, you see. They stick to neoliberal policies, and they accept the current position that Brazil has in this international division of labor, which is a subordinate position. And then it appears that the issue of the BRICS, you see. So with the BRICS, what Lula means, he does not he does not have any expectation of Brazil becoming a kind of imperialist country, you see. With the BRICS, what Brazil is trying is to benefit from these changes in the international world order to see if he can make better business for Brazil, you see. Maybe to bring some industrialization to Brazil. When he came from his visit to China, he announced that he wanted the Chinese capitalists to come to Brazil to invest in new industries, particularly in this electric car industry. So he's trying to benefit from this dispute between the US and China to try to bring some business for Brazil. And Bolsonaro was the same. He was not different from this. For instance, Lula also says openly that he stands for a multipolar world, you see. So the BRICS would help this process of having a kind of alternative to US imperialism. Bolsonaro, look, while he was the president of Brazil, he visited China, and he came from China saying that China was not socialist or communist anymore. They are capitalists, and we must keep our connections with them. And then just before Putin announced the invasion of Ukraine, Bolsonaro was there with him and said, we stand in solidarity with the Russian people. So Bolsonaro also was doing the same politics of Lula with a different wording, you see, which is this multipolar world may benefit Brazil, and he is trying to benefit the Brazilian capitalists, Of course, Bolsonaro has another issue, which is he believes that it's necessary to have a strong government. He means a dictatorship, you see, clearly. And so he looks to China, he looks to Russia, and he sees in these regimes, political regimes that would be interesting, that would fit his aspirations for Brazil. Okay, but what's important for us to see? What's the situation of the working class facing this situation of this new position of Brazil in the International Division of Labor, and the politics of the both sectors of the bourgeoisie, of the Brazilian bourgeoisie. One today is represented by Lula administration, and the other one was represented by our former president administration. What happened to the Brazilian working class is that we have, since these neoliberal policies, we have less jobs, we have less good jobs. Good jobs, I mean, these better off workers, they are much smaller today than they used to be due to denationalization and deindustrialization of the country. The minimum wage is very low. It's $260 US, the monthly minimum wages. 60% of the Brazilian working class makes up to 2 minimum wages. So they make up to $500. And together with this situation of exploitation, we have together with it, we have a process of defunding of public education and public health care. We have an increase of violence, be it police brutality or machoist, racist, LGBT-phobic or xenophobic violence against the working people. And another issue that always calls a lot my attention, which is the increase of homelessness. In the city of São Paulo today, the situation is horrible. There are, in accordance to the city of São Paulo authorities, there are 52,000 people living in the streets. So the situation of the working class at this moment is very, very, very bad. And then it raises the question, will this multipolar world or empowered BRICS alliance, will it make the situation better for the working class? The government, they say yes, the BRICS will help Brazil to have more jobs and they say all of this, but the fact is that this visit of Lula to China, for instance, there was a commitment to increase the exports trade of Brazil towards China, you see. But the effect on the working class is not that it brings more jobs, it brings inflation of food, and it brings more mining. This mining industry is very destructive regarding the environment and affects the lives of the communities which are around these mining areas. So what I see is that having a stronger BRICS or any kind of multipolar world does not bring a solution for the working class. It's not something that help jobs or less violence or better wages. It does not lead to this. Recently, what we saw here these days, there is a discussion because the Brazilian oil company, Petrobras, they want to explore oil in the place where the Amazon River meets the Atlantic Ocean. And the environmentalists are totally opposed because it may destroy the environment there. And now Lula is in this situation, which is he's selling to the world the idea that Brazil now is completely committed to the defense of environment, but at the same time, he would like to have this oil explored, you see. But the environmentalists, what they say, hey, aren't we going to make a transition to clean energy if we are going this direction? So the exploration of oil in this area of the Amazon River meeting the Atlantic Ocean should not be the right policy. So what I see, that for the working class, what would be necessary is to end this imperialist order, you see? So we don't need more imperialists, you see, one fighting with the other. We should stand to end all of them. That should be the policy coming from the working class, you see, to meet our needs. And to end the imperialist order, it's necessary for us to look to the classes that are interested in in this policy, which is the working class internationally. You see, the working class internationally will benefit a lot if we finish with this imperialist system, if we finish with capitalism and build a socialist world order, you see, where there is no exploitation between nations, where there are no borders. This would make all the wealth of the world to come back to the working class. At last, I would like to mention this meeting of the G7 imperialist nations that met in Hiroshima in the last 3 days, you see. Two things called my attention. One is that one of the resolutions is to stop Chinese aspirations to become an imperialist power, you see. So put pressure on China, to encircle China with armies and these military policies. Okay, so this plays on this dispute between the US and China. But the other one that calls my attention is the politics of these G7 nations towards Ukraine. The wording is a wording that we stand with Ukraine, we will stand with Ukraine till the end. They repeat that. But at the same time, if we pay attention in what was decided there, look, the Biden announced that he will allow other countries to sell or to deliver F-16 planes to Ukraine. Look, up to now, after more than 1 year of war, the Biden administration did not allow any country that has F-16 to deliver these F-16 planes or to sell to Ukraine. So I think that's very important for us to pay attention, because the politics of the these imperialist countries, the Western imperialist countries plus Japan, it's not to provide the necessary weapons that Ukraine needs to defeat the Russian invasion. Their politics is to prevent Putin from coming down, so Russia cannot lose the war, and at the same time, Russia cannot win the war because it affects the capitalist interests, not only in Ukraine, but other parts. So the G7, they play a kind of piecemeal provision of weapons to Ukraine. And for the working class, it would be necessary for the Ukrainian people, in particular, the Ukrainian working class, to expel the Russian troops, because the defeat of Putin in Ukraine may bring about an uprising of the working class inside Russia. You see, that could end this autocratic regime that there is in Russia, based on the secret services and the oligarchy. And it also would, let's say, wake up the oppressed nationalities inside and outside Russia. You see, a victory of Ukraine would be very, would be in the benefit of the interests of the working class in their fight for liberation. Well, I stop here, and now I will listen to your opinions, and then we have an exchange. Okay, thank you, Chair. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, Fabio. So I don't think that Kavita has joined us. So we're going to go ahead and go forward with the discussion and questions. And if she does join us, though, we definitely will give her an opportunity to speak. So again, Linda will be the timer. Each person will have 2 minutes, but you can come back in again. And we will give the speakers an opportunity to possibly answer questions during the discussion. We'll see how that goes. And then they will be able to come back at the end, Fabio and Patrick, for any final comments. Okay, so Virginia, go ahead. Oh, you need to unmute. Virginia.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much to both of the speakers. I have a question for Fabio and for Patrick. And to Fabio, it's a question of, do you see any prospect in the near future of solidarity between the mine workers for the corporations in Brazil and the communities who are affected badly by the oil explorations? And for Patrick, I was wondering, in terms of the, was there any intention on China's part to bolster South African infrastructure and manufacturing, or did it always intend to export its products, its manufactured, to Africa? Or it's many questions in this one question. Is the lack of industrial infrastructure in South Africa more due to Europe's underdevelopment of Africa or Western neoliberalism?
Okay. Ted, go ahead.
Okay, well.
Oh, sorry, Ted. I accidentally muted you. Sorry about that. Ted, go ahead. You got to unmute.
Okay, don't mute me again, please. I wanted to say thank you to both Patrick and Fabio. I think they were excellent presentations. And I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit them to just a couple. It seems to me that one important thing we should be talking about here, and that Patrick and Fabio maybe can help us with, is the divisions among the BRICS. And I think there's one important underlying division, which is that China and India are industrializing, and Brazil, as Fabio mentioned, but also South Africa and Russia have been deindustrialized. Brazil, South Africa, and Russia have been returning more and more to primary product exporters and importers of industrial products. And whereas India and China are on a different path. Okay, that's the first question is, can you, both of you, address that? The second one is, Patrick talked about accumulation by dispossession. And Fabio talked about the lumpen bourgeoisie around Bolsonaro, which I believe is really into accumulation by dispossession. It seems to me the
10 seconds.
The leader of that is Putin, which is what he's doing in Ukraine. I'd like more about that. And the last thing, could you more directly address the issue of the BRICS and Ukraine, both of you? Thank you.
I don't see any other hands raised, and those are two big questions, the questions from Virginia and Ted. So Patrick and Fabio, why don't you go ahead and address the two questions, so the questions asked by Virginia and Ted.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. Well, Virginia's putting her finger on it. In fact, somebody just put the finger on my electricity and it went off. And this is now, sort of 10 hours a day. And I can find some of the fingerprints, Virginia, in Beijing. So some would say, yeah, China is a very important player in Africa because it develops the forces of production. You might have heard of Bill Warren. There's a whole sort of theory that there's a sort of more organic capitalism coming into Africa because it's not purely neo-colonial Western. In fact, the opposite is true. And the fingerprint of Beijing on my lights having just gone off. Luckily, I have a little battery for my router, but you'll just see the darkness descending. The Chinese fingerprints are exactly in infrastructure because they've been part of the looting of the two main parastatal agencies, through corruption. One, the China Development Bank lending massively to Eskom, a very corrupt state agency, for a project, a huge coal-fired power plant, 4,800 megawatts, called Kusile. And it's just been revealed, and the guy running Eskom just walked out 2 months ago, and you know, in a huff, and has just written a book last week that came out describing in more detail exactly that corruption. And China's financing of Kusile is central. China's also been central to the deindustrialization through not just the massive imports, because, you know, there's South Africa neoliberals very explicitly opened up to GATT in the mid-90s, Nelson Mandela's government. I happened to be a sort of policy drafter, wrote the first policy for the new government, and saw very much firsthand that neoliberal agenda. I'd be happy to share any of the gory details with anyone. But the point about that is that it was in that first round of deindustrialization that Virginia's concerned with that we saw especially labor-intensive industries, clothing and textiles and footwear and appliances and electronics completely disappear with a few small residues. But also then when the extractive industries took over, China's played a very important role. And those are in areas of mining, of smelting, and in the transport of these. And China has been buying more coal from South Africa in the last couple of years. And then when it comes to China's reindustrialization, especially in auto, because South Africa is sort of a major auto producer, we're finding lots of scamming. And the major plant, it's in an area, Nelson Mandela Bay, called Kabeja, and the Kucha plant of Beijing Auto Industrial Corporation, and another plant of First Auto Works have been real scams. I can provide all the details. So yeah, it's been very disappointing. And I spent earlier this month a week traveling around Zimbabwe, the country just to the north, and watching Chinese extractive industries absolutely looting the place, hand in glove with a very corrupt president. Now, we can go into all the details, and I'll put a link there, but it goes to show, I think, that the myth that China is an alternative to the West on capitalist opportunities for Africa is belied by this role in amplifying, especially extractive industries and accumulation by dispossession. And I think there, Ted, it's very interesting to look at not just that earlier deindustrialization, but the ways in which in the BRICS, as you're asking, sort of where does Ukraine fit? They absolutely deny these conflicts. So the worst conflict within the BRICS must be China and India on the Himalayan border, where literally dozens of troops have been killed, literally throwing each other off the mountains because they're not allowed to bring guns into that area, thanks to a 1962 agreement. And that area, that little contestation of barren mountainous area that sometimes goes into Bhutan, kept Narendra Modi from joining the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017. He nearly didn't go to the BRICS meeting. So there's a lot of ongoing tension geopolitically there. It extends to the way China wants to take advantage of Pakistan to import lots of its oil from the Persian Gulf straight into Western China, rather than through that precarious long route through the Singapore and the South China Sea. And then finally, what do the BRICS have to say concretely about the illegal Russian invasion, the denial of sovereignty? They often talk about the need to protect sovereignty, but when it comes to what Russia did, we got lots of evidence over the past 14 months, mainly from the BRICS summit in China, which was a virtual summit. And the main reason it was held very quickly in late June last year was because both Narendra Modi and Cyril Ramaphosa were invited to the G7. This year only Modi went, not Ramaphosa. It was sort of seen as a bit of a slap. But what did they say about Ukraine? Absolutely nothing. There's just no discussion in the BRICS, in the foreign ministry, and any of the academic forums. They're frightened of these divisions. And this goes back, as I say, to all the conflicts, all the internecine battles. It's true, as you say, Ted, that the deindustrialization bifurcates the BRICS into three countries, actually, that are basically raw material suppliers. Three economies, South Africa's, Brazil's, and Russia's, and two that are growing quickly by not being simply looted. And I hope the BRICS from below and all of the forces that are at work can address these central contradictions. And certainly we will see, and I think I'll wait till Tuesday for the next group of South Africans to discuss, much better qualified than me, to talk about when they have raised Ukraine in Durban because of the military exercises that South Africa, China,
30 seconds.
and Russia did. That debate back in February, March this year did bring forth protesters. There have been mainly liberal and white capitalist concerns about the impact of this current fracas with the United States on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. So it might be that I'm wrong, that there will be incentive and some opportunity to really raise the contradiction of BRICS saying that they're for multipolarity and respective sovereignty on the one hand, but basically through the UN abstentions and through all these military deals, still protecting Putin.
7 minutes for Fabio.
Yeah.
Virginia, there is a necessity of this alliance between the mine workers and the communities. In general, they do not happen because there are different interests involved in this. Because the workers need the jobs and the community needs to stop the mining, at least the way it's done. But there are some cases, particularly after some disasters, that you put both together. You see, here there is a place where there is a lot of mining here to the north of São Paulo. It's a state called Minas Gerais. There was two, because the mining industry, they make dams, you see, with toxic waste. And in two places, these dams broke and destroyed all the area, killed the workers. And so there was strong movements putting into discussion the mining industry itself, you see, how it should be done and so on. We must put our efforts to unite these two exploited sectors, you see. And I see that in Latin America, in countries like Peru, this has been developing much more, this alliance between the communities and the workers in the mining industry. Regarding this, what Ted asked, of course, the BRICS are not equal countries. That's obvious. You see, China is a rising power. Yes, Brazil is just trying to benefit from the division of this struggle in the international order. So, of course, China looks to Brazil as first a source of iron ore and other rare earth minerals and beef, you see, and soybean. That's Brazil for China. And also a geopolitical ally to counterpose the pressure that's coming from US imperialism. So it's a, how can I say, a subordinate position for Brazil. So they don't share the same interests. And the Brazilian bourgeoisie, they look both to the US, Europe, and China to see where I can get the best deal. You see, okay, I will be subordinated, but I want to benefit, you see, from this. That's the Brazilian bourgeoisie. It's a kind of coward bourgeoisie, you see. They just want to be minor partners of the big corporations, be them American, European, or Japanese or Chinese. So I definitely agree that the BRICS are not an alliance of equal countries. You see, there is the same division that we have in the world is expressed inside the BRICS. This issue of the lumpen bourgeoisie, first that Bolsonaro, yes, the lumpen bourgeoisie is all with Bolsonaro, that's for sure. But there is also a section of the normal bourgeoisie, let's say. I mean, the financial sector, part of it, minority, but part of it, the agribusiness bourgeoisie, they are with Bolsonaro, you see? And why? Look, in a situation where you have the majority of the people living in difficult situation, you may have social explosions. You see, you may have uprisings. They are happening here in Latin America in many countries. And so there is the need of a Bonapartist government. You see, Bolsonaro, after he was elected, there was an uprising in Chile in the end of 2019. And Bolsonaro was always warning the bourgeoisie. He was saying, we will not let this happen in Brazil. We will be a strong government against any kind of uprising and this kind of stuff. So the bourgeoisie, they see that they may need a dictatorship, you see? So at this moment, minority. But if we succeed in mobilizing the working class, maybe the larger sections of the bourgeoisie will move to the other direction, you see, to see the needs of a Bonapartist regime. It's not the case now, but it may be the case in the future. And what I see is that they don't want to finish the Brazilian bourgeoisie, even this one that wants a kind of liberal democracy, they don't want to finish with the far right. They want to keep the far right. Okay, so, and yes, the lumpen bourgeoisie, this one that want to destroy the Amazon rainforest, for sure they are with Bolsonaro. And I agree with you. I think that Putin also is playing a lot of this kind of capitalism, you see, with this Wagner group that is spread in many countries in Africa and Syria, even the arms industry, the way they are developing it. So I agree with you. And finally, BRICS and Ukraine. Look, I'll tell you about Brazil. The politics of the Brazilian bourgeoisie, be the one that is with Lula now or the one that is with Bolsonaro, is the same. They don't support Ukraine. They don't support Ukraine. They want to have connections with Putin. So the politics of Brazil is very clear. When Lula say, no, I want to many countries together to bring peace to Ukraine. What's this peace? This peace means give part of Ukrainian territory to Russia and stop the war. That's the politics of the Brazilian bourgeoisie, which is expressed, very well expressed by Lula. You notice that Zelensky could not meet Lula now in Hiroshima because Lula did not want, and then he found a part in his agenda, then Zelensky could not. Brazil wants to be neutral, but a neutrality in favor of Putin, seizing part of Ukrainian territory. That's the politics, and I can tell you, a large part of the left wing here in Brazil, they support the same politics. It's a shame, it's horrible to say that, but that's the reality. I finish here.
Thank you.
Linda, go ahead and I'll time you. Okay.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I've always, for some time I've viewed the BRICS as being the result of the loss of the Second World. We had unipolar imperialism, and countries like China and Russia help apply a brake to the expansion of U.S. and European imperialism, sometimes by helping out national liberation struggles. But once that situation fell apart, you suddenly had several newly countries that became more capitalistic, either from a non-aligned position like India or socialist positions, sort of a state socialism or deformed socialism, whatever you want to call it. They joined the fray and we now have our multipolar world that these pacifist groups seem to think is such a wonderful idea. But what it does is it leads to a shrinking base of countries to be exploited by these new, all these new capitalist imperialist countries, which is going to increase the speed with which a crisis occurs. And that's why so many of these countries, including even the advanced countries, are looking more and more towards fascism. But that's pretty much my comment. Thanks.
Okay, Stanley, Stanley, go ahead.
Talking about the global South, I can understand why a lot of the working class there is not supporting Ukraine when they see Zelensky supporting apartheid Israel, or when he goes to the Arab League amongst the monster kings and dictators there, watching him shake hands with the Saudi Arabian bin Salman, or seeing him at the G7 with the top capitalists. So my first question is, isn't there an alternative way for a Ukrainian administration to act? Second question, Patrick, could you talk about the financial backer of the Campus People's Forum in the United States, this fellow Roy Singham, and what he did in South Africa? And lastly, in Brazil, Fabio, have there been recent working class efforts to expose the BRICS or more generally oppose Lula's pro-business policies? That's it.
Hey, John.
I just have to unmute myself. First of all, on this concept of multipolar world, which is really integral to the whole concept of BRICS. And in practice, what it really linked to the fascist call of Dugin and so on for Eurasianism. And it's no time to develop this adequately, but we see also different so-called lefts like Vijay Prashad who have linked themselves with this fascist call for Eurasianism. And it's a really visible example of what's happened to the so-called socialist left all around the world. And it's a betrayal of the principle of international working class solidarity. And it shows that the socialist movement has to reconstitute itself. And for that to happen, we need an uprising of at least a sector of the world working class. And I think that we can prepare the way by learning some lessons from what's happened in the past. And incidentally, the transformation of both Lula and Ramaphosa from working class fighters to representatives of the most predatory forms of capitalism really is a lesson for all of us. But in the meantime, we can start to develop some direct links and perspectives and program, and also start to work together, the genuine working class socialists in the so-called global North and global South, and develop those direct links. And I would just like to conclude by repeating the last question in the announcement for this event. How can the left in the quote global North that supports Ukraine work more closely with the left in the BRICS countries? And I hope that we think about that, and including possible in-person meetups.
Okay. All right. There are no more hands raised, although I'm thinking about raising my own hand. Patrick and Fabio, why don't you go ahead and respond to those recent comments?
I'd like to propose 10 minutes apiece.
Okay.
I can take less, but I also want to throw a question to Comrade Fabio. And it relates in a way to the topic raised by Stanley, Fabio's point about campism, or sort of third worldism that is sympathetic with Putin. But very quickly, before that, I think if the dilemma for our big mass movements that have been badly fractured, the labor movement especially, John, is where are there opportunities for solidarity? We don't really know. We actually had some Ukrainian visitors last month, and we were, I won't go into details now. I don't know how much the trip has been sort of kept under wraps. But we were really at a loss for words, aside from putting pressure on South Africa's government. But the independent left doing so has been pretty ineffectual. I mean, the real pressure, as you've just seen, comes from the US Ambassador Ruben Brigetti, the threat that the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act will be chopped. I argue in the ZNet that I'll post the link for you now, that might be a good thing, to lose access to US markets for our steel, our aluminum, our petrochemicals, or some of our automobiles may cut jobs, but I think it would actually save jobs net, because those big producers of exports coming into the US at a zero tariff through the AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, they chew most of the electricity. Literally 27 companies are responsible for 40% of the electricity consumption, and they're all multinationals, and they're all involved in these very capital intensive and carbon intensive activities. There's a second layer of that which is coming down, which is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and the third layer is interesting too. It's called the Just Energy Transition Partnership. And in all those ways, I'm hoping that the kinds of politics that bring us together in the interests of internationalism and working class solidarity can also extend to environmental solidarity and the critiques that good Ukrainians have of the ways in which the IMF is bearing down on them. There's a terrific interview that was just posted on YouTube involving CADTM, the Committee for the Abolition of Third World Debt, with, I'm not going to get her name right, I won't try, but with Eric Toussaint, with Sacha Van Daar. And you can look that interview up to just get a sense of how the commonalities of oppression, economic oppression, are affecting the likes of the Ukrainian working class and us as well. Which brings me to the question, and it really is so poignant to hear from Fabio, the sense that the majority of the Brazilian left, and I'm not going to say the same for South Africa, because I don't think that's true, but that are essentially pro-Putin in their neutrality. And the dilemma here is we have major institutions, the largest trade union in the country, in the continent, in fact. Yes, thank you, Yulia Yurchenko. Thank you, Cheryl. But that extraordinary union, which has fought so hard and valiantly, and has a generally, sort of socialist perspective, is very openly pro-Putin, or at least the top layer of leadership is. The South African Communist Party is pro-Putin, and a substantial chunk of the leadership of the African National Congress. The people as a whole are generally voting, when there are polls, sort of opinion polls, generally voting against Putin and saying, yeah, we should be taking a more condemnatory stand here. But I do think this is where, Fabio, our interests are very much together on the independent left in worrying about whether the campus left or pro-Putin, pro-China left, and some names like Roy Singham or Vijay Prashad have been mentioned. I'm tempted to go into all sorts of details, but I know that there's time is limited. But I also know that on Tuesday, you could tune into Micah Reddy from the Amabungani Investigative Journalist Collective here, who's done an extraordinary piece of deconstructing where this network comes from. And he's done not just the South Africa piece, but the global piece. So that'll be on Tuesday, and I think you have the link. I would just say in conclusion that it's one of those times when the clarity of a class struggle perspective versus a nation state conflict is absolutely crystal clear. And I think the job of any socialist is to find the right balance, right, between the anti-imperialism and the sense of class struggle. I thought one recent article, it came out end of April, by Michael Karachis, it's on commons.com. I don't have the link, I'll find it and put it on. But I thought that did quite a good job. And the last point I'd make, but before asking Fabio especially about Celso Amorim, the main foreign policy advisor to Lula, or Paulo Batista, who had worked in the BRICS New Development Bank as a vice president, as key functionaries in this attempt to remake the BRICS and reinvigorate it. But I would say that one of the things that really has made me so inspired by my comradeship with Brazilians is to learn about how Rui Mauro Marini, whose book in English, The Dialectics of Dependency, was published, maybe you'd be surprised, by Monthly Review Press late last year. And that book really helps us to understand why sub-imperialism as a concept is both critical for thinking about deputy sheriff duties, even antagonistic cooperation with imperial military and geopolitical power on the one hand, but especially with super exploitation internally. Let me turn it over to Fabio, but thank you very, very much for hearing me out.
Fabio, hold on one second. So Danny Mitchell has his hand raised. Danny, do you have a question that Fabio would be able to address in his comments, or would you rather wait and come back after he responds?
Well, actually, it was an extension of that the last speaker's question about the resistance. Patrick told us a little bit about the BRICS from below. That sounds like a movement that's just in South Africa. And what I was going to ask is there a presence of this BRICS from below in all 5 countries, or is it just a South African thing? And that's where Fabio might tell us what the Brazilian left is doing if they're not doing a BRICS from below movement. And that's mainly my question. Clarify what roles in South Africa and Brazil and maybe the other 5 countries that the left does have, like BRICS from below. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, Fabio, go ahead.
Thank you. First, Stanley addressed this issue of the role of Zelensky. And I think the role of Zelensky is very problematic. I follow a lot the politics in occupied Palestine. And the fact that Zelensky is a Zionist himself, of course, does not help us to bring the support from the Palestinian people to the struggle in Ukraine. But we must remember that the main ally of the Zionist regime in occupied Palestine is Putin. It's not Zelensky. You see, the Netanyahu has an agreement with Putin to send planes and bombard Syria every week. He does it in weekly basis. So Putin is the main ally of Israel, and that's why Netanyahu did not want to give any kind of support for Ukraine. But I totally agree that it's a disaster for Zelensky to have this unconditional support for the Zionist occupation. You see, other day they sent a message standing with Israel against Gaza. It's horrible. And this visit to the Arab League is also problematic because that place is full of dictators against whom the Arab working class and the Arab people stood up against in the last 10 years. So it's also a problem. But I think that maybe the main problem we have with Zelensky is that Zelensky, what he's doing inside Ukraine, you see, when he and his supporters carry out labor reforms against the workers, labor reforms that he could not do it before the war. You see, he's taking advantage of the war to carry out reforms against the working class. He's allowing the capitalists, the oligarchy, the Ukrainian oligarchy, to put up prices in such a way that it's leading the majority of the Ukrainian people into poverty. And he's working for the reconstruction of Ukraine under a capitalist basis, delivering the best of the wealth of the country to European and American corporations. So it's in reality, Zelensky, okay, he's taking the lead in the war against Russia, but he's not an ally of the working class, you see? there is a kind of unity in action at this moment. But the Ukrainian working class will have to take a stand and fight against these labor reforms and against poverty and against these capitalist reconstructions that Zelensky is standing for. About this issue of against the BRICS, working class and BRICS here in Brazil, there is little discussion about this. And this happened because, you see, the Workers' Party, Lula's party, is the largest party in the country. It's larger, it's stronger than the right-wing parties, you see. And almost all the left wing at this moment are supporting the Lula administration. And so there is little discussion about this issue of the BRICS, because the bourgeoisie supports it as a way to try to get some benefit from this conflict between the US and China. And the working class, the majority believes that the left-wing leaders, they believe that it would be good to have a multipolar world, and so the critical voices are limited to intellectuals, to some forces of the left wing, which include my force, but we are a minority in this discussion. So the opposition comes, how can I say, in practical terms, you see, when, for instance, the Chinese car auto industry here in Brazil, they are over-exploiting the workers, the union goes there and there is a strike, and that's the way that there is a resistance against one of the effects of the BRICS, which is the penetration of Chinese capitals inside the country. But there is no organized movement. What else? I agree with John that socialism must reconstitute its efforts and stand for socialism. We must talk about socialism, you see, because well, Lula, let me tell you something else. Lula has never said that he is a socialist. He has never been a socialist. And he openly says that, you see, he stands for liberal democracy, with which will help the working class to have a better life under capitalism. That's what he says. And how can the left support Ukraine? We must join all efforts we can to put the working class together with the Ukrainian communities, the Russian opposition groups, you see, together to fight against the Russian invasion, and demands the countries, the governments, to give all support to Ukraine, all support they need, food, weapons, whatever. You see, that's the way I understand that we should do, and that's what we are doing here in Brazil. And about Patrick, I also agree that these workers' internationalism must include the issue of environmental solidarity. You see, I think the defense of environment is a working class issue, because the working class needs it. So I think I see things together. Rui Mauro Marini, yes, his works were republished in Brazil. They are not exactly popular, you see, but I have a couple of books by him here at home. And these ones that you mentioned, that are, one is the Minister for Environment of Lula, Marina Silva, and the other one is Dilma Rousseff, our former president, who is now the president of the Bank of the BRICS. They are together with this politics of Lula. Essentially this, Marina must play the one that's talking about environment. So she said, no, the Brazilian oil company cannot explore oil in this place where the Amazon meets the Atlantic Ocean. So she took a stand, but if the government decides to do it, she what she will do. See? And Dilma Rousseff she was the president of Brazil. She agrees with all this politics of Lula. There is no qualitative difference. That means it's a capitalist organization, liberal democracy, neoliberal policies, some social policies to the poor. That's all. She's not different from this. I think I addressed everything I took note here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, Simon has his hand raised. Go ahead, Simon, and then I'm going to call on.
Yeah, just want to thank the speakers, and I'm just coming here with an announcement. Many times Patrick mentioned the meeting that's going to be on Tuesday, so I just want to say a few words about this. We're going to have what we called a global meeting of the Global Network in Solidarity with Ukraine, which was initially organized by the European Network in Solidarity with Ukraine to get in contact with the groups, organizations, and individuals from around the world, in different parts of the world, who are on the left, so in the trade unionist movement, feminist movement, who support Ukraine in various regions of the world, because we see as a vital thing to get all the like-minded people to have the option to exchange opinions and to know each other, because we think that is the thing that is we really need that in the time that we're in terms of the solidarity with Ukraine. And so I'm sending the registration link. I sent it before, but there are some people who joined later, so they didn't probably see the chat. So that's the registration link. If you want to see how it looks like, how the meeting are organized and what we talk about at the meetings, I can just post two other links from the meetings. One is focused on Brazil, which Fabio was actually one of the speakers, and the second one is from the East Asian Pacific region, a very interesting one. I really recommend everyone to see that. Also Patrick, but some other speakers from South Africa will be there. Probably people from Mali, from Mauritius, from Sudan. So I really hope you can make it. I know the time might be problematic because we do that at 3 o'clock Central European time. So I think it's 6 o'clock in the morning in California, and like 9 o'clock in New York area. But we did that because one of the South African speakers wanted to be at 3 o'clock South African time, and it's the same as Central European time. So basically,
time's up.
Everything, yeah, okay. Just a second. Everything will be recorded if you wanna see that. But if you can, we really appreciate if you would take part in the meeting. You have the registration link there. It will be somehow also related to this discussion, because obviously BRICS is one of the themes that will show up, but also the Wagner Group and Russian imperialism in Africa, the situation in Sudan. We have a speaker from Sudan, so I think that will be very interesting. And all the solidarity work done by African groups in solidarity with Ukraine, which we really, let's say let's call it the Western world, really don't know much about. So I really recommend that. And I don't know if Dennis is here, and he recommended that also, I think that is related to this discussion, that Commons, the Ukrainian journal, has thematic debate, which is called the Dialogue of the Peripheries, which try to collect articles of the authors from the Global South about the situation in Ukraine and in solidarity with Ukraine. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Cheryl?
Yeah, so I've got some comments and then a question. So Fabio and Patrick have covered really thoroughly about all the ways in which the BRICS nations are not progressive leaders in the world, and how they are just a sub-imperialist bloc that highly exploit their workers, that are totally on board with destroying the environment. And many of them are, most of them, all they're very autocratic, very repressive, totalitarian type regimes. I don't know that I'd say fascist, but we know that about them. I'm not sure about Brazil in this time, but so we have that picture of what the BRICS nations represent. And yet I can only speak in this country because this is the experience I have. The left in general has elevated the, maybe with the exception of Modi, but certainly, I mean, this false picture that somehow they are, this is a beacon of, it's an alternative to US imperialism. And that's all that matters. It's an alternative to the United States and to NATO. And that's all that really matters to them. So it's a horrible situation. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming, honestly. So, but I guess, so for me, I mean, I really appreciate the presentations because it's giving me more concrete information about exactly what these governments really are and their role in the world and how to talk to people about that. But so my question is I don't really know how anybody would characterize, Fabio, how would you characterize the current government? I mean, the Lula government in terms of being a repressive regime. We know that Bolsonaro was very much a Trump type of a leader in terms of being anti-vaccine, I mean, very repressive. What would you say about Lula in that regard?
10 seconds.
So, and the same thing with South Africa.
10 minutes apiece.
Would Fabio want to go first? Fabio, you still there?
Sure. Look, no, Lula is not an autocratic, does not lead an autocratic regime. He stands for liberal democracy. So he takes the example of the United States of Biden, you see, which is a democracy that's useful for the rich, you see. But the working class managed to get some liberties, some freedom, which is very useful for us to self-organize. So that's the politics of Lula. But I warn you, if there is an uprising in Brazil, I'm sure Lula will not think twice before sending the police and the army against us, okay? So that's a bourgeois democracy. It's a democracy to defend the interests of the bourgeoisie through democratic means, which includes police brutality, which includes the action of the army. But at this point, there is a liberal democracy. So the revolutionary parts are legalized, the unions are legalized, there is free speech. You see, despite of the fact that the media is controlled by 6 families in Brazil, we have freedom to do something outside this bourgeois network. So that's Lula. I just want to say hello to Shimon. We are working together in building solidarity to Ukraine, so I'm happy to find you here. And well, that's it. So it's different from China, from Russia, where there is no freedom, no democratic freedom. Brazil is different from this. Maybe Brazil looks like South Africa. I'm not sure. Patrick can tell us.
Right. I'll maybe conclude then with just a quick sense of where our neoliberal nationalist ruling party has come from and where it might be going to. I mean, the dilemma of Lula with the capacities during the early 2000s, I think it was 2003 to 10, raising a Bolsa Familia grant and particularly raising the minimum wage and therefore cutting poverty and inequality by, let's say, before 2013, Fabio, when Dilma turned neoliberal, actually doing some redistribution, even within a welfarist perspective. And then also having a very ambitious policy to imprint Brazilian capital in Latin America, but also in Africa, in Angola, Mozambique especially. So our neoliberal nationalism has been different because it's been accompanied by class formation, something that Frantz Fanon, would have not been surprised one bit in the book, The Wretched of the Earth, the third chapter, Pitfalls of National Consciousness, a sense that a Black bourgeoisie ran up against the barriers of white settler capital and of international capital, and so became a very, very parasitic and corrupt version, even including President Ramaphosa, whose main wealth came from being a comprador for companies like Lawnmen, where he kick-started a massacre in 2012, and at the same time he was the major Black coal mining tycoon. And it's that context, right, that helps us explain why a sub-imperialism is a good way to understand Ramaphosa's particular positioning currently as generally favoring the West, favoring foreign direct investment, favoring the extractive industries. But as Sam Moyo from Zimbabwe, who's was our greatest Marxist from the neighboring country until his death in 2015, and Paris Yeros, who's based in Brazil, as they've argued, there's a schizophrenia that is characteristic of sub-imperialism insofar as that, as Marini put it, that antagonistic cooperation sometimes hits the barriers of what space-time displacement of capitalist crisis will allow. So these frictions are now in full view, and South Africa is very ill-equipped to handle them. And what I suppose we would hope is that part of the friction that comes from Ramaphosa cozying up to Putin, but also trying to keep ties as strong as possible, including arms sales to NATO, will create the irresolvable internal geopolitical and ideological problems for his own party, that he may be swept out of power. There may be in 2024 a minority ANC vote. They've always had above 60% since President Mandela was elected in 1994. And at that point, they will probably have an alliance with the populist left, which is pro-Putin, the economic freedom fighters. So we're in a very fluid situation. And I think keeping an eye on, especially those of you in the States, with that very poignant statement by Cheryl about how difficult it is when my enemy's enemy is my friend becomes the mentality of so many of the left. And I just saw John's critique of Code Pink, and the reference to what Micah had been revealing, and he'll do so again on Tuesday, I suspect, about why that fraction of the left has taken on something so absolutely irrational as the BRICS as their champion. And when the imperfect character of our national states, when we have pretty much no state that we can find on the independent left to be compatible, and we look for leaders with some tradition of social democracy like Lula, or some hope for a new pink tide coming up again in Latin America. It just shows we have to do much, much more organizing on the ground, given the realities that we're not talking about, Cheryl, I'm sure you agree, an alternative to imperialism in the BRICS. We're talking about an amplifier. We're not talking about anti-imperialism. We're talking about sub-imperialism. We're really not talking about a project, the BRICS, being against global corporate power, but instead within. Thanks very much, comrades.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much to everybody for participating, and especially to the two speakers. We really appreciate it.